The dark side of DNA tests. Woman uncovers century-old family mystery. Just like any other new technology, DNA testing has its pros and cons. And as author Margaret Atwood pointed out, there are some unexpected drawbacks to consider. 8 years ago, Alice Collins Plebeach, a 72-year-old resident of Washington, made a decision that would change her life. She decided to send samples of her saliva for a DNA test, just for fun. Given the strong religious background of Alice's parents, she felt confident in her expectations for the DNA test results. However, when the results were revealed, Alice was taken aback. She had a misconception about her true identity. Alice and her siblings embarked on a lengthy quest to unravel the enigma surrounding their identities. Alice had been consumed by questions about her family for a long time. Alice's mother had a keen interest in genealogy. She cherished an old family book that contained the handwritten names, births, and deaths of all their beloved relatives. Alice found it straightforward to trace her mother's ancestry. Even in the pre-online era of genealogy, her mother's heritage was a mix of Irish, Scottish, and English. Alice's family had a long history in America, with some relatives dating back to colonial times. She even managed to trace some of her mother's ancestors all the way back to the 1500s. However, every time Alice received an update about her mother's ancestry, she couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt due to the contrasting story of her father's side of the family. "My dad had a very limited background. He didn't have much of a history," she shared with journalist and author Libby Copeland. Jim Collins' father was Irish descent. His knowledge of his family history was limited. Jim's mother had passed away when he was a baby, and his father was unable to take care of him and his older siblings. As a result, he made the difficult decision to give them away to a Catholic orphanage. Jim spent a significant portion of his life unaware of his true birth year, mistakenly believing he was a year older than his actual age. With her father's advancing age, Alice felt compelled to delve into his ancestry and uncover his origins. Prior to starting the project, she was already familiar with certain aspects of his childhood. Alice was aware of the challenges of growing up in an orphanage. She suspected her father's time there had affected his health, as a doctor later suggested that his small stature might be due to malnutrition during the stay. She was aware that he had departed the orphanage during his teenage years, and he had a rebellious nature before enlisting in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and marrying her mother. Additionally, she was aware of her father's estranged relationship with his brother and the tragic loss of her late aunt during her childhood. Jim was a dedicated Catholic who enjoyed preparing a delicious corned beef dish on St. Patrick's Day. However, Alice was unaware of the origins of the mysterious individual and the fate of his parents. When Alice's father passed away in 1999, she felt unable to share anything with him that he didn't already know. Over time, Alice managed to uncover a paper trail of some kind. Jim grew up in a humble neighborhood in the Bronx, New York. Jim's father, Joseph, worked as a driver, while his mother, Katie, sadly passed away when he was just 9 years old. She discovered the name of the orphanage where he spent his childhood, the St. Agnes Home and School. Even though the school had closed down, she managed to discover the names of a few of the sisters who were employed there. Alice reached out to them, hoping to gather any useful insights about her father. Alice was only given Jim's admission and discharge dates by the orphanage, without any additional useful information. After a considerable amount of time, Alice's research yielded no results. Then, in 2012, at-home DNA kits became accessible to the public. Alice was filled with joy. She had recently stumbled upon what she believed to be her father's ancestral village in Ireland, and she was contemplating a journey abroad to explore her grandparents' roots. Alice recognized the convenience of an at-home DNA test for her research, prompting her to eagerly join the company's waiting list. After receiving the tests, she and her sister Jerry quickly swabbed their cheek and promptly sent them in. When the results came back a month later, Alice and Jerry were quite perplexed. Only less than 50% of the sisters' DNA results were of Irish, Scottish, and English descent. The other half of her DNA was an unexpected combination of European Jewish, Eastern European, and Middle Eastern. This puzzled Alice because both of her parents were from the British Isles. Surely someone at the testing lab had made a mistake or accidentally switched them with someone else's. Alice wrote the testing company a letter explaining their mistake. She decided to take the test again. But when the same test came back for a second time, Alice knew that the report was correct. Several questions popped into her head. Who were her parents? Did her mother have an affair? Alice was determined to get to the bottom of whatever family secrets had been kept from her if her parents weren't who they said they were. That meant that Alice, by extension, wasn't who she thought she was. The DNA test results were only the beginning, as they provided Alice with the what, but not the why. While intense research and analysis might intimidate some people, Alice was not thrown off. She had worked as an IT manager at the University of California before she retired, and at a fairly sophisticated level. In 2017, Alice liked to find patterns and chaos and answer big questions with complex answers. After getting over her initial shock, Alice got straight to work. Maybe her mother had an affair or her grandmother, but this scenario seemed unlikely. Cheating was out of character for Alice's mother, and all of Alice's siblings shared her father's eyes. Still, the question lingered in the back of her mind. My father, he was in the army, and he was all over the world, and it just is one of those fears that you have when you just don't know, Alice told author Libby Copeland. Alice and her sister had a gut feeling that the lineage came from her father's side, especially since he was adopted. Were her father's grandparents secretly Irish Jews or maybe Eastern European Jews who said they were Irish when they immigrated to America? As a precaution, Alice had two of her cousins, one on each side, take a DNA test. The results from her maternal cousin came back normal. The two shared 12.5% of the same DNA, meaning that they were first cousins. But the test results from her paternal cousin were peculiar. The test showed that Alice and her cousin, whose mother was Jim Collins' sister, shared no DNA. In other words, the two were complete strangers, genetically speaking, and weren't actually cousins. This also meant that Alice's father's sister wasn't actually his sister. Alice was less than pleased with this outcome. She found herself starting over and feeling anxious about the possibility of being rejected by her dad's side of the family, considering that they weren't biologically related. After analyzing the data, Alice and her sister Jerry reached the conclusion that their father, Jim, had no biological connection to his parents. I completely lost my sense of self, Alice remarked in 2017. I felt lost and unsecure of myself. I had no idea about my true identity, my authentic self. However, for Jerry, the test results validated a sentiment she had harbored for quite some time. Jerry had long believed that Jim's father didn't resemble anyone in her immediate family. However, during a trip to Ireland in the 90s, she discovered that her 5'4" dark-haired father didn't resemble anyone there either. Jerry had harbored this feeling for years, but when she saw the DNA test results, her intuition was confirmed. With her father and her parents deceased, Alice and Jerry realized they needed to uncover their father's enigma by engaging with the living. Were there any siblings in her father's family? Did those siblings have any kids? Did Alice and her siblings have any distant relatives they didn't know about? In 2013, the Collins children were making progress in unraveling their father's enigma. They discovered their father's birth certificate and also found out that Jim had been placed in an orphanage by the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. Alice pondered if her dad had been mistaken for another child when he was taken from his home. Perhaps there was a mix-up at the orphanage between her father and another baby. Based on her intuition, Alice decided to share some of her old family photos with a forensic artist. The pictures included one of her father as a baby, sitting on his father's lap, and another of Jim as an adult. Alice was curious about whether the persons in the photos were the same, but unfortunately, this train of thought led nowhere. The forensic artist confirmed that it was indeed the same person, indicating that the orphanage had not mistaken her father for another baby. So Alice started brainstorming a new concept. Perhaps, she pondered, her father was swapped at the hospital. Could there have been an error on the part of the hospital? Alice was intrigued by the idea of exploring the babies born in the same hospital as her father in 1913. However, this proved to be quite challenging. The list of children born in the Bronx in 1913 was quite extensive, spanning 159 pages. However, it lacked any specific order by date and did not distinguish between home and hospital births. Upon thorough examination of the file, Alice managed to narrow down the list to children who were born around the same time as her father and had names that sounded either Jewish or ethnically neutral. Alice had a grand total of 30 babies. She was optimistic that among those babies on the list, there might be living relatives who share the same DNA as Alice and her siblings. Alice went through all 30 baby names, but once again, she didn't find anything. Alice meticulously sifted through over 6,000 individuals who were identified as potential biological relatives based on the DNA's online database. After tirelessly searching for 2.5 years, she unfortunately could not find a match. Alice's optimism began to wane. She could only wait for someone to contact her. Then, on January 18, 2015, Alice's life took a dramatic turn. It was a Sunday morning, and she was feeling a bit low. She chose to reach out to her cousin, who wasn't her biological relative, to give him an update on her search that had hit a roadblock. Out of curiosity, Alice decided to take a look at her cousin's list of DNA relatives on his genealogy account. It was a rare occurrence for Alice to do something like this, especially considering how infrequently new relatives made an appearance. However, on this particular day, Alice made the decision to investigate, and to her surprise, she discovered a new individual. A stranger submitted her DNA sample, and the results revealed a close familial connection to Alice's cousin. Alice then decided to reach out to the stranger and inquire about the test results, hoping they aligned with her expectations. I was surprised to find out that my Ashkenazi heritage was not as prominent as I thought, the woman expressed. Jessica Benson, a curious individual, decided to take a test on a whim in order to gain insight into her Jewish heritage. Surprisingly, Jessica revealed that she found out she is actually of Irish descent, which came as a complete surprise to her. Alice experienced a sudden sensation of chills. She replied to Jessica, sharing her grandmother was born at Fordham Hospital on September 23, 1913. Has anyone in Jessica's family been born around that date? Jessica promptly responded, confirming that her grandfather, Philip Benson, was indeed born around that time. Alice started to shed tears. She had a hunch about what had occurred, but she required evidence to confirm her suspicions. She carefully examined the birth records of New York City from 1913. No Benson was born on that day in the Bronx, but Alice eventually found what she was searching for after a few hours. There happened to be a Philip Benson who was born on the same day and at the same hospital as her father, Jim. Alice had a strong intuition that Philip Benson was responsible for what had happened to her father. There was no hidden family secret tainted by shame. It turned out that someone at Fordham Hospital had simply made an error that day, an error that could only be revealed through the use of new technology. Interestingly, a Jewish baby had been mistakenly sent home with an Irish family, while an Irish baby ended up with a Jewish family. The women were taken aback. Upon comparing the birth certificates, it was found that Jim and Philip were processed consecutively and signed by the same doctor. Alice was taken aback by what she discovered when she delved into the methods hospitals used in the past to monitor newborn babies. Alice discovered that hospitals lacked any sort of organized structure. Many of the newborn babies were stored together in the same cart, increasing the risk of accidentally swapping a baby. Back in 1913, hospital births were not very common, and many hospitals hadn't figured out how to identify newborns yet. Some hospitals chose to have newborns stay in a crib next to their mother's hospital beds, while others opted for nurseries. Although the exact practices at Fordham Hospital before its closure in 1976 remain uncertain, it is reasonable to assume the latter. Hospitals started providing mothers and newborns with identifying bracelets in the late 1930s. In 1913, nurses commonly relied on their memory or the mother's recognition of the newborn. Once the truth came to light, the Benson and Collins families shared pictures, bringing clarity to the situation. Jim Collins resembled Philip's parents more closely in terms of height, as opposed to Philip himself. "Did my grandfather reach the same height as my dad?" Pam Benson, Philip's daughter, said. The Collins sisters also had their own perspective on why their father wasn't as tall as his siblings. It was commonly believed that Jim's malnourishment during his time at the orphanage was a reason behind his physical condition, as the doctor had suggested. Alice never imagined that her father wasn't biologically related to his brother and sister. It's a fascinating discovery that can only be revealed through the power of DNA technology. Alice quickly learned about her biological first cousin, Phyllis Pullman. It turned out that Phyllis was the first daughter of Jim's previously unknown sister. In 2015, Alice made the decision to fly to Florida to meet her. Perched on opposite ends of the sofa, the two women could easily be mistaken for siblings. Their genetic makeup was undeniably similar. Phyllis recounted a charming anecdote about her Uncle Philip's early days of courtship. According to Phyllis, she had to provide her birth certificate to prove her Jewish heritage to her skeptical parents, who were observant Jews. She shared this with the author, Libby Copeland. Surprisingly, it turned out to be something other than his birth certificate. The two families have maintained contact over the years, but they can't help but wonder about the possibilities that still haunt them. While the two families are filled with joy at their reunion, there's also a sense of sadness due to the unexpected revelations. How can Alice and Pam reconcile the truth about their fathers? And then came the investigations regarding religion. I'm curious about Jim Collins' background. Was he born into a Jewish family or raised in an Irish household? So how does this impact his daughter Alice? Alice and her sister both felt that it would have been the right thing to inform their father if he were still alive. However, they are relieved that Jim did not have to live during the time when at-home DNA testing became so popular. "My dad would have felt completely lost," Alice said. "He hasn't had to deal with that." Alice and her siblings also ponder the potential outcome if their father had chosen to reunite with his biological family. As the Bensons and the Collins families share photos, Alice couldn't help but feel a twinge of envy. It's unfortunate that Jim found himself in an orphanage. Alice pondered about the potential life her father might have led if he had been brought up by the Bensons, his biological relatives. Well, to begin with, Alice pondered, Jim must have had a stable upbringing. He would have completed high school and surely pursued a career in mathematics, given his talent. Instead, Jim made the decision to leave high school, served in the Army, and eventually found employment as a California prison guard. Jim managed to create a satisfactory life for himself, but Alice and her family are filled with sorrow over the loss of their father. Alice shared that during the time in the orphanage, her father received an orange as a Christmas gift. If the switch hadn't occurred in 1913, Alice and her siblings wouldn't have come into existence. The Collins children's lives were saved due to an unfortunate error caused by a nurse's momentary lapse in attention. It was a regrettable error, but how can Alice hold on to resentment for what occurred? However, without the events of 1913, Alice Collins' plan book would not have come into existence. The lives of the Collins' children were saved due to a simple mistake by an administrator or a brief moment of distraction from a nurse.